Hello, everyone. Tonight we are settling into the faint creak of wooden floorboards, the soft shuffle of boots on plank aisles, and the barely there aroma of coffee that has been sitting in a tin pot since before dawn. The little frontier church is drafty enough that the hymn books flap slightly in the breeze that slips through the warped siding. You take your seat in a pew that has precisely the wrong slope for comfortable sitting, and you notice that every hymn book is different, one with a missing cover, another with notes penciled in by an ambitious tenor from years past. Don't worry if you doze off before Pope Gregory reforms the calendar. Tonight is not about rushing anywhere, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And, of course, I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The Sunday service on the frontier does not begin at any particular hour. Not exactly. It starts when the preacher arrives, or when enough people have made the walk, the ride, or the wagon trip to justify opening the hymn book. In summer, the sun slants through the tall plain windows, painting angled bands of light on the bare, plank floor. In winter, the windows frost at the edges, making the whole world outside look like it has been gently erased. You light a stub of candle in your mind, even though here in this rough wooden church there are only oil lamps hung on hooks. The flame sputters faintly whenever the wind pushes through the wallboards. In the front, a simple lectern, built from the same unpainted pine as the pews, waits for the preacher's hands. The sound of the opening hymn is honest. Some sing in key, some near it, and some boldly ignore it altogether. The pump organ in the corner wheezes like an old mule on a steep hill, but it soldiers on. You notice the organist pumping the pedals in time with her own head nods, which may or may not match the beat of the hymn. Scholars still argue whether frontier congregations sang more slowly to savor the words, or simply because the organ could not manage a brisk pace. The sermon begins with a slow clearing of the preacher's throat. He is a man of many words. You can tell because he has marked at least 3 bookmarks in his Bible, and the stack of sermon notes looks like it might double as a doorstop. Outside, the faint metallic sound of a horse's bit rings through the open window, but no one turns to look. They've learned it's better not to be distracted, because once the thread of the sermon is lost, there's no getting it back. A soft joke of the evening arrives when you realize the preacher has said, and in closing, at least twice already. This is not a hint of the end, but rather the frontier equivalent of a polite pause, like turning a page very slowly. Sometimes the service is interrupted by something mundane but irresistible, a loose board snapping under someone's weight, or a baby discovering the echo of its own voice in the empty rafters. No one minds. The sound of life is as much a part of the worship as the sermon itself. You glance at the walls. They are plain, save for a small, slightly tilted painting of a shepherd and his sheep, which has been there long enough that no one remembers who put it up. A crack runs through the bottom edge of the frame, and you imagine a time, years from now, when it might simply slide off and land in someone's lap mid-sermon. The service ends not with a bell, but with the scraping of boots as people rise. Stretching from the long sit, a few linger to speak with the preacher, who grips each hand warmly, as though he has been waiting all week for these conversations. Outside, the prairie stretches in all directions, the air clean and carrying the faint smell of dust and grass. It is here, among the endless sky and the steady hum of cicadas, that you think about how far people traveled just to sit in a creaky pew for an hour or two. If the preacher felt inspired, you wonder if perhaps the journey was part of the service, a quiet act of endurance that bound the congregation together as surely as the hymns. And maybe, in the slow stillness of this Sunday, you find that you are almost ready for the next hymn to begin. The creek is not especially wide, but it is fed by a spring somewhere upriver, which means that even in midsummer it runs with a stubborn chill. You are standing on its bank now, hat in hand, feeling the grass beneath your boots give way to mud. The congregation has gathered in their Sunday best, though the wind keeps pulling at skirts and hats, as if it's trying to usher them back toward the safety of the church stove. There is no baptismal font here, only this long curve of water under the open sky. You can hear it sliding past smooth stones, the sound soft but constant, like the faint hiss of a kettle that's almost boiling. Those who have been baptized before keep a respectful distance, hands folded, while those waiting for their turn watch the water with the kind of quiet that comes from knowing it will soon be wrapping around their ankles, their waist, their shoulders. The minister steps down first, wading in until the hem of his long black coat darkens and clings. He does not flinch, but you suspect his toes might be less stoic than the rest of him. In his voice there's the low rhythm of someone who has done this many times, a calm announcement of the names, a blessing carried away by the breeze. Scholars still debate whether frontier baptisms were intentionally scheduled in the cooler months to discourage large crowds, or whether the weather simply refused to cooperate most of the year. Either way, there's something about the shock of cold that makes the act impossible to forget. You watch as the first candidate steps forward, shoes left neatly on the bank. The water curls around their calves, then their knees, until they take a slow breath and clasp their hands. Down they go, briefly swallowed by the creek. The surface shivers once, twice, before they emerge, dripping and breathless, the wind tugging at their hair. Someone on the shore lets out a soft amen, which hangs in the air like the mist above the water. Your first quiet joke for the day is realizing that the ducks a little farther upstream seem to be conducting their own version of the ceremony, dipping under and popping up again with far less reverence. In this place, the baptism is both ceremony and endurance test. The water bites at the skin, sending prickles all the way to your elbows. When it's your turn in this imagined stillness, you step in slowly, the mud cold between your toes. You think about the countless others who stood here before you, some with knees knocking from the chill, others barely noticing in the heat of summer. And while the ritual itself is over in seconds, the walk back to the shore feels longer, heavier, with the wet clothes clinging to you. Someone hands you a rough towel, the kind that smells faintly of cedar from being stored in a trunk. You wrap it around your shoulders, feeling the sun's weak warmth on your face, and listen to the next name being called. There's an odd comfort in knowing that this same creek has seen every kind of weather and every kind of believer in spring. It swells with rain, carrying bits of driftwood past. In winter, ice curls along its edges like lace. And yet the baptisms go on. Your second soft joke slips in when you notice that Sister Abigail, who swore she was just here to watch, is standing suspiciously close to the waterline, as though ready to volunteer if the minister glances her way. Some in the congregation murmur about the theological symbolism, the death and rising again, the washing away of sins, while others, less abstract, simply note that nothing wakes a soul faster than water that could have been ladled straight from a snowmelt. Both, perhaps, are true. As the last candidate steps out, their face bright with relief, the congregation sings a hymn without the organ, the notes floating out over the water. The breeze carries the sound downstream, past the reeds and willow branches, toward places unseen. You dry your hands on the hem of your coat and take one last look at the slow, unhurried current. It feels as though it will keep moving long after you've gone, long after this day is only a soft blur in memory, the water still cold, the voices still echoing off its surface. You hear him before you see him, the faint clop of hooves on hard-packed dirt, the squeak of saddle leather, and the gentle jingle of a coffee tin tied to his pack. The traveling preacher rides into town without hurry, dust settling behind him in a thin trail, like smoke from a lazy fire. His horse is sturdy, not flashy, the kind with a calm eye and a gait that doesn't jostle the Bible strapped to the saddlebag. On the frontier, a preacher might cover 100 miles in a week, looping between settlements like a thread sewing together patches of worn cloth. He carries little more than the essentials, a well-thumbed Bible, a stack of hymn sheets that have seen more wind than daylight, and a few biscuits wrapped in a scrap of flour sack. Some say the biscuits are for emergencies, though it's never been clear whether that means hunger or unexpected hospitality. The preacher arrives in the late afternoon, when the shadows of the town's few buildings stretch long across the main street. People step out to greet him, some genuinely glad, others with the careful politeness reserved for guests who might stay longer than expected. He tips his hat, asks after the health of Mrs. Porter's knee, and mentions that he's heard the mill is finally running again. Scholars still argue whether these circuit preachers were more effective as spiritual leaders or as the town's informal news carriers, given that they could report on everything from a family's new calf to the progress of the railroad to counties over. The answer may be a polite both. You watch him settle in for the evening service. There's no church here, not yet, so the gathering will be in the largest building available, which tonight happens to be the general store. Shelves of flour, bolts of cloth, and tin lanterns serve as the backdrop for the sermon. The preacher sets his hat on a barrel of nails, lays his Bible on the counter, and begins in the slow, steady voice of someone who knows there's no clock to beat. Your first soft joke arrives when you notice a little boy staring at the preacher's horse outside, clearly weighing whether it would be a sin to borrow it for a quick ride while the sermon is going. The preacher speaks not only of Scripture, but of neighbors far away, the Jones family in the next county, who just built a schoolhouse, the Blackwoods, who finally got their well to run clear. His words weave together the scattered lives of the frontier, so that even in their isolation, people feel connected. You think about the long miles between these visits, dust storms, sudden downpours, the way the prairie can feel endless and still never quite familiar. There's a certain quiet courage in traveling with no guarantee of shelter at night. Only the hope that someone will offer a corner of the barn and a plate of beans. Your second soft joke appears when the preacher takes a sip from his tin cup, mid-sermon, and winces, clearly discovering that the coffee inside has been in there since morning and possibly longer. After the sermon, there is no rush to leave. People linger, asking questions, sharing small troubles, and offering news. The preacher listens, as if each word is worth carrying to the next town. By the time the lamps are dimmed, he has gathered a bundle of stories, some to share on the road, others to keep tucked away in his own memory. When the town sleeps, the preacher lies down in the hayloft of the livery stable, his horse shifting softly below. The night air smells faintly of alfalfa and dust. Somewhere in the dark, he's probably thinking about the road ahead, the creak of the saddle, the stretch of the prairie, and the waiting faces in another settlement he's eaten this month, a scale that somehow runs from nearly pleasant to useful as wagon wheel chocks. And when morning comes, he will ride on the horizon, swallowing him in the same unhurried way it always does, until the sound of hoofbeats fades into nothing but wind. You notice the plate first, a plain tin circle that has known as many potlucks as sacraments, polished to a soft, uneven shine by 100 careful cloths. Upon it rests the bread, yesterday's, or perhaps Tuesday's, depending on the week, cut into tidy squares that attempt dignity but look more like small, polite attempts at survival. You take your place in the slow line, the floorboards murmuring under everyone's weight, the lantern light burning amber along the pewbacks where earlier you traced the nicks and knife scratches left by restless hands. Somewhere in the room, you can still catch that memory of old wax from earlier, threaded through the simpler smells of pine and dust. This settlement has a minister most weeks, but communion only when the circuit brings him back with enough time and enough supplies. Some months a storm delays him. Other months a wedding or a funeral changes his route. Scholars still argue whether frontier congregations observed communion quarterly because of theology, or because the traveling schedule made anything more frequent unworkable. The truth is probably a quiet handshake between both. Tonight, the elements have arrived by wagon wrapped in cloth, jostled over miles of ruts and dry creek beds until even the stopper on the bottle has developed a weary rattle. When the plate comes, you hold it carefully, as if it could spill light. The bread is dry, yes, but it has the faint sweetness of flour that was sifted in a hurry, and an amiable sturdiness that suggests it has been waiting patiently for this moment. You take a piece and pass the plate along, feeling the soft bump of tin on your palm. Somewhere behind you, the pump organ offers a low, wavering chord, as though clearing its throat and deciding that is sufficient accompaniment for now. The cup follows, not a chalice of silver, but a bottle decanted into modest glasses that used to host lilacs in early spring. The liquid glows a dusky purple in the lamplight. Some settlements use wine, some use boiled grape must, or the new pasteurized grape juice that certain temperance-minded congregations have begun to favor in these late 19th century years. A dentist back east has famously perfected a method to keep the juice from fermenting. Word drifts outward on the same dust lanes as everything else. You raise your glass, and the scent is gently grape, gently rode, as if the prairie itself had leaned into the flavor. Your first soft joke arrives as you realize the tiny cube of bread requires a surprising number of dignified chews, and you hope the hymn will run long enough to cover your quiet perseverance. This is not a hurried table. The minister speaks in the even cadence of someone who has learned to match his voice to the settling of the room. He names gratitude like a list: the safe arrival of the wagon from the south, the rain that came at last, the mended roof, the child who learned to read, the neighbor who shared seed corn, the way the horizon keeps getting wider, and yet somehow you still find your way home. You listen and feel the words settle into the spaces between people, knitting their practical kindnesses into something larger than usefulness. There's an odd, off-topic comfort on the windowsill, a small jar with 3 buttons and a marbled game piece that no one claims. A little frontier, lost and found, of the domestic mysteries that follow every gathering. The evening wind nudges the curtain, and the lamp flame behaves itself with the restraint of an usher who has seen everything. You remember that on the frontier, communion often required improvisation, a loaf from whoever baked last, a bottle from whoever had the least rattling wagon that week. Scholars still debate whether the earliest congregations in these parts watered their wine to stretch it, or whether they abstained entirely and used juice to align with the rising temperance movement. The evidence, like the road, wanders. There are letters noting unfermented wine, recipe clippings for boiling juice down to a syrupy must, and occasional references to a kindly farmer's pressing, which could mean almost anything when written by a preacher trying to be polite. Your second soft joke tiptoes in when you notice Sister Abigail, renowned for her pie auction victories, quietly eyeing the communion plate as if mentally calculating crumb structure, then catching herself and folding her hands in fierce piety, which is somehow even more endearing. When your glass is empty, you hold it for a moment, feeling the warmth from your fingers seep through the thin glass, then set it back, careful not to clink. Around you, throats clear, boots adjust, a baby sighs that long old soul sigh babies manage when they are full of milk and mystery. The organ breathes another chord that sounds like the boards settling after heat, which in a way is what the whole evening is doing, settling. On the plain table, the minister has placed a worn linen cloth. It's not white anymore, not exactly. It holds the faint colors of previous seasons, as if dust has a palette you can learn to recognize. Spring's pale yellow, summer's honest brown, autumn's copper hint. He lifts the cloth and smooths it with his palm. The gesture has the quiet of a bedtime prayer, one that does not strive for eloquence because it knows. The drowsy language of gratitude is eloquence enough. An older man across the aisle closes his eyes, not in drama, but in rest. If he sleeps, he sleeps in the way of someone who knows that being present is sometimes the same as being peaceful. The children have learned to be statues at this hour, though one traces shapes on the pew with a finger, a wagon wheel, a star, a loaf, as if catechizing the wood itself. Your third soft joke lands as you consider that, for all the frontier emphasis on sturdiness, the plates and glasses seem to multiply only when there's washing up to do, an arithmetic that favors dishwater over destiny. The minister speaks a final blessing, and the room remembers itself. People rise slowly, the way tall grass rises after wind. The plates and glasses are gathered with the delicate clatter of small things that have done big work. Someone hums a fragment of Rock of Ages, and it fits the space like a familiar coat, a little frayed at the cuffs, perfectly warm. Outside, the sky has gone the deep, velvet blue that makes distances feel friendly. You step into it, and the air carries a mild sweetness from the riverbank willows. The path home is rutted but sure. You think about how communion here is a discipline of unremarkable details: a square of bread, a traveling bottle, a table that tries its best, and how those details, stitched together by repetition and kindness, become a sturdy thing to carry across a wide, uncertain land. Back in the doorway, someone has left a note pinned neatly near the lantern hook. Remember to return Mrs. Wilcox's spoon. It is not sacred, and yet it is not sacred. It is exactly the sort of sentence that helps a community continue from one ordinary grace to the next. You tuck the thought away with the last flavor of grape on your tongue, and you begin the quiet walk, the boards of the porch answering with their gentle, faithful creak.